Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the No Man's Land. I'm Angela Ramirez. Today we're going to be talking about the rise of 20th century Marxist rhetoric in the United States, specifically the rhetoric of Marx, Lenin, and Mao, and how there are certain groups that are now kind of organizing here in the U.S. and working to create policies and advocating for certain agenda items. Here, I guess, in 2020. So we do have an article up on the site. Of course, you guys can always go there and look at our sources that we reference. These videos are kind of just to help you. If you don't have time to read the blog, you can listen or you can watch the video. So 2020 has ushered in an obvious change in the United States political and social climates. One of the most alarming developments in our country right now is the open support and the traction of various communist political parties. Now, there are multiple Maoist, Leninist, and Marxist parties in full operation throughout the U.S. The reason that I identified Marxist as separate from Leninist and Maoist, obviously communism as an ideology comes from and is credited to Karl Marx and Engels, but there are slight differences in the philosophy between Marx's original work and Lenin's approach and Chairman Mao's approach to this, I guess, ideology. So that's why, if you're wondering why I specifically cite Marx, that's why. So basically, to get a lay of the land, I started a running blog that's going to keep track of the communist parties that are currently operating in the United States. So, like I said, Karl Marx is typically credited with the development of communist social and economic rhetorics. So, therefore, technically, all types of communism are technically Marxist. However, when we look at all the different subdisciplines, specifically Lenin and Mao's, there are some slight differences, which is why, again, I have kind of separated that. So, to get started, we're gonna look at some of these groups that are actively operating in the United States today. The first one that we're going to look at is the Maoist Communist Party Organizing Committee, which goes by For the People on Facebook and typically in public. That's most likely because enough people are aware of who Chairman Mao was to kind of raise a red flag if they were to hear Maoist Communist Party. So they go by For the People. So the Maoist Communist Party Organizing Committee, they go by MCPOC for short, is a group that regularly attends the Black Lives Matter themed protest throughout the United States. They operate in a number of cities from the east to west coast, including Salt Lake City, southern Colorado, Boston, Chicago, etc. If you guys are interested in a full list, you can get the link. I'll link it below. So MCPOC is the Chinese dictator. Well, the Maoist Communist Party is obviously based on Mao Zedong's philosophy. Quotes from Mao are scattered throughout their site, and writers for the website regularly author really radical communist articles that glorify the fall of capitalism and encourage the overthrow of the, according to them, so-called United States government and culture. It's really worth noting, I think, that the Maoist Communist Party's website, which can be found at maoistcommunistparty.org, they did not start publishing content until roughly the end of 2019, which is interesting because that is just 1 year, obviously, before the 2020 election here in the U.S. This is just a look at one of their posts on their Facebook. This is like a huge block of text. I'm not going to read it all because it's just a bunch of communist rhetoric. But basically, they say that they're anti-capitalist, they don't like capitalism, they're firmly committed to certain Marxist agenda items that are usually like the typical start of Marxist culture, which is like things like combating food and housing insecurity, which I think we can all get on board with. It's just the fact that their approach to it has been proven time and time again to be ineffective. They state that they are rooted in concrete experiences and practices that rose from revolutionary experiments in China, the U.S.A, and the Black Panther Party. So those are kind of their role models, I guess. Nowhere have I seen them publish any sort of content that addresses the fact that the Maoist communist experiment killed about 65 million people, they have really not mentioned that anywhere in at least any of the writings that I have seen, and I have studied their website and all of their content. They really just kind of neglect to address that. The Maoist Communist Party has been directly involved in the Defund the Police movement. I am here in Colorado, and so I have been watching their movement here in this state specifically, and I've been to the protests that they have organized, which are really interesting because they organize the protests and a number of armed individuals go. This is not a weapon-free zone in any way in any way, shape, or form. They bring assault rifles, and I don't want to say they, because I cannot prove necessarily that the individuals who were armed are like actually a part of the organization. However, and that's in part because they come with face coverings, and a lot of these people who work with the movement hide their identity, their real identity online for protection. That said, the people that I do know for sure are a part of the Maoist Communist Party did not come armed. However, a number of people who were there supporting them, whether or not they were directly involved in this group or were just kind of loosely associated with MIPOC, they were heavily armed, very, very heavily armed. There was Antifa present. There was a number of people with face masks and assault rifles. So that's worth noting. They have, they have been involved for sure in protests in the Salt Lake City, Chicago, and Twin Cities area in Minnesota. They are active on social media, although they don't have a huge following on social media. It seems that they use Facebook almost exclusively to organize. Everything else is kind of just a propaganda outlet. Here we have on your screen, if you're looking at this, we have a Instagram post from Young Black Maoist. Young is spelled Y-U-N-G. And it's a picture of, I believe that is Stalin. And, these communist guys back here. We have, it is Stalin. Marxism and the national question. There's a quote from Stalin here on this post. Here's a For the People Philadelphia post from McPock. The MCPOC directs its cadres to unite whenever possible with formations which organize for Black liberation, principally the new African Black Panther Party and the United Panther Movement. So these guys are actively involved in the Defund the Police movement. They are actively involved in this whole Black liberation movement. And I think that's really worth noting, especially because, this whole movement didn't really instigate until 2020, the year of the election. And this page, the whole website and social media pages really didn't get established until about 1 year before the election. So it's really worth noting. Sorry guys, I did not get a lot of sleep last night. So that's really worth noting because it's an election year. The Maoist Communist Party is based in Chinese communist rhetoric, and we do know that China has taken steps and measures to infiltrate and adjust the results of our election, or influence the results of our election here. So that's worth noting. The next organization that we're going to cover is the Democratic Socialist Association, which is called the DSA for short. This is probably one of the biggest, if not the largest, socialist organizations in the United States. They claim to be the largest socialist organization in the U.S. I don't know if they're basing that off of their idea reach, or if that's based on numbers of participants, but they do state on their site that they're the largest socialist organization in the U.S. The DSA is a Marxist group. By default, they are pretty much based in traditional Marxist philosophy and ideology. They don't really have the Leninist and Maoist spins to the association. I think the most alarming thing about the DSA is not the fact that they are regularly involved in the defund the police movement or these protests for basically Black liberation and revolution, but my red flag went up when I realized that they actually have a youth program called the YDSA, which introduces students to socialism by integrating YDSA chapters into college campuses throughout the U.S. And it's not just small community colleges. It's not just like really small schools in rural towns. They're actually found in some of the largest universities here in the U.S. They have a chapter on Harvard University, Colorado State University, Berkeley, and Brown University. They have a huge number of chapters for the YDSA actively operating on college campuses. And I think this is really worth noting because those of you guys who probably follow this content are aware that a number of the people coming out of colleges today have been kind of indoctrinated with Marxist rhetoric without ever actually being told that it is Marxist in foundation. And so that's why we're seeing, at least in part, why we're seeing a huge number of college graduates and academics really take the side of Marxist doctrine. So I think that's worth noting that we do have active socialist influence being integrated into very well-known and what most would consider to be quality education institutions, or at least they once were quality education institutions. I don't know at this point that colleges are, and that's obviously a different topic for another day. But anyway, the DSA is heavily involved in the defund the police movement, social media connections to individuals on college campuses, and in-person representations at protests is leveraged to spread the DSA's message. The group teaches Marxist philosophy, but they do regularly post content that is sympathetic to the Bolshevik Revolution, and they do encourage Leninist revolutionary philosophy. They claim to be organizing for power, which is consistent, obviously, with Marx's belief that everything in the world is a power struggle. Like I said, the DSA has been involved in the defund the police movements. They were on site at the Seattle Chaz. They had a booth set up there. I thought that was really interesting. They do openly publish abolitionist content, and it seems that they organize regular events for the defund the police movement here in Rochester, where we recently saw the Rochester riots over the death of Daniel Prude. We actually see here that on September 9th, they held an event at Martin Luther King Jr. Park in Rochester, New York at 7:30. Whether or not this turned into a riot, I'm unsure. I haven't looked into that specifically. But here we do have, obviously, an event organized by these guys, and if not organized by them, then promoted by them. So here we have on the Rochester DSA name, they actually have the Black Lives Matter hashtag. This group uses a rose to kind of as their logo and symbol. If you guys see a rose floating around at these protests, it is the DSA or the YDSA. They use the same logo. The next organization that we're going to talk about is the Black Lives Matter Global Network. The Black Lives Matter Network is a politically oriented Black advocacy group founded by self-proclaimed trained Marxists. Most of you guys have seen the video of Patrisse Cullors saying that she's a trained Marxist. The organization, this is what I find most interesting about Black Lives Matter, is the fact that they have actually leveraged the history of slavery of Africans in the United States and the subsequent oppression and segregation of Black Americans, which obviously was wrong and oppressive and evil, and it caused long-term effects. So it is an example of, it is a very valid example of oppression. What's interesting is that they utilize this real issue to leverage the Marx Engels frame of thinking, and then they therefore group people into classes of oppressor and oppressed. Now, the reason that I find this very interesting is obviously because nobody has owned slaves in the United States in almost 200 years, and also the fact that segregation obviously didn't end until my grandparents' lifetime. And so we do still see a ripple effect from that, right? So it's a legitimate issue, but But that said, what they have done is leverage that legitimate issue to create systems of class guilt, which is a Marxist concept. So they create class guilt and leverage the class guilt to point out flaws in individuals who are, I guess, the oppressor class today, and to justify revolution in people of color and Black Americans. And I find that really interesting because it can be rationalized, right? Like, you could rationalize and say, well, yes, African Americans have been oppressed in America, and there's no doubt about that. There's definitely been racism in our country. There's definitely been slavery. There has definitely been segregation, and all of those things do not come without repercussions. That said, this group is basically utilizing that as a platform to push a Marxist agenda. And I don't think that a trained Marxist is necessarily ignorant to that, right? So I kind of point that out in the blog. I think that's a really interesting thing to point at. Obviously, Black Lives Matter has been one of the fundamental triggers for the defund and abolish the police movement. They have been a huge component to the protests, the so-called revolution, etc. The next group that I want to bring up is the Movement for Black Lives. The Movement for Black Lives is very interesting as well because on paper they are a different organization than the Black Lives Matter Global Network. They are also a 501c3 fiscally sponsored nonprofit, just like the Black Lives Matter Global Network. But they're fiscally sponsored through different organizations, and on paper they are obviously different owners, different donations, different fiscal sponsors. So on paper, different organizations. But that said, what is very interesting is the fact that the Movement for Black Lives allocates a portion of their donated funds to the Black Lives Matter Global Network. And on their donation checkout page, they actually say that the Black Lives Matter Global Network is a part of the Movement for Black Lives. So they say here, and this is actually from their checkout page, what we're looking at now. So if you look at their checkout page, it's interesting because they do use a very similar logo to the Black Lives Matter Global Network. Also, if you were to go to their website, you would see that the color scheme is the same. It's black and yellow, just like the Black Lives Matter movement. So here on their donation checkout page, it says that your dollars will be put to work where they're needed. The Movement for Black Lives is made up of over 150 organizations that coordinate actions, messages, and campaigns. Organizations like Black Alliance for Justice, Immigration, Blackbird, Black Lives Matter Network, right? So right there it says that the Movement for Black Lives is made up of different organizations, which includes the Black Lives Matter Network. But for some reason, they're different organizations on paper. So essentially, I guess, the Movement for Black Lives is kind of like an umbrella for all of these groups that are working in the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think that's kind of interesting to note because it kind of almost disperses responsibility for the movement in such a way that no one person can be responsible for anything that goes awry, right? So Black Lives Matter and the Movement for Black Lives, they both use the same ideology and goals. They have identical coloring. Their checkout page obviously says that they're part of, that they kind of represent the BLM. Their political goals include, so their political goals include communist agenda items such as community-owned property, reparations for Black Americans, obtaining Black political power, and the redistribution of wealth, among many other things. They are currently the sponsors of the Breathe Act, and I definitely recommend, if you guys haven't been to their website, I really highly recommend spending some time looking at their 5-year plan and their Black Power Rising ideology. They actually have a whole idea set up for gaining Black political power, which is how they put it. They say Black political power, and essentially, reclaiming property is kind of like what they think that they're going to do. So very interesting. Obviously, this group has gained quite a bit of traction. Of all the groups that are listed on this blog, it's probably the movement for Black Lives and the Black Lives Matter movement that have the most traction with the public. Now, the next group that we're going to talk about is the Communist Party of the United States. These guys are interesting, and I included them because they are active on Twitter and social media. They do have a following there. They were founded in 1919, which, for those of you guys who are not familiar with Russian history, that is pretty much the height and pretty much the start of the Bolshevik Revolution, which started in 1918. 1917. And so this Communist Party, excuse me, this Communist Party is a Leninist political party. And the reason I say it's Leninist is because, they were founded in 1919. They utilize the hammer and sickle logo. They also regularly publish, propaganda, but they do say that they have the intention of bringing socialism to the United States. The fact that they were founded in 1919 leads me to believe that they were influenced by Leninist philosophy, obviously because Lenin was kind of running the show at that point. Anyway, so the party has 31.5 thousand followers on Twitter, which is quite a substantial following considering Twitter does not allow certain conservative voices on their platform. However, we can have openly the Communist Party of the United States pretty much openly functioning on Twitter, no harm, no foul, which is insane considering what happened during the Bolshevik Revolution. And if you're not familiar with what happened during the Bolshevik Revolution, may I recommend reading the Gulag Archipelago. It might take you a year to read it because it's a 600-page book, and most people only read no books, 0 books all year. But if it takes you a year and if it takes you 2 years to read, it's really worth reading. It's a fantastic book, and it really shines a light on what happened in Russia. Here in America, we really have no idea about what happened in Russia or whatever happens in Russia. We just kind of think of them as these evil, Far East superpower people. And, I think it's really important to humanize the Russian people and to understand their history and to understand what happened there so that we can not only find a way to build a bridge and make amends, but also to prevent what happened during that revolution from happening elsewhere in the world by educating people on the truth of the matter. Not even the truth of the matter, but just to understand, the facts and events and effects of that revolution on the people of Russia, both then and today. I think that's really important. So that's why I included them in this blog. Obviously, they are active on social media and they have a following, therefore they are influential to an extent. They do offer Marxist-oriented educational tools to encourage people to get educated about what Marxism is and, I guess, training people on Marxism. Here's a post from their Twitter page. It says, "What is our role as communists in the People's Front against fascism? What does a decisive defeat of the fascist danger look like? Check out our discussion at our next Marxist class on Sunday, September 27th at 8 p.m. EST. Register in the link below." And here we have a group of people who are supposed to be the working class, and it looks like it's a pilot, a doctor, and a construction worker kicking Trump out into nowhere. I think that's kind of funny because pilots and doctors actually make quite a bit of money. They make, a pretty decent amount of money. Construction workers are more considered the working class, and so I think it's interesting that they decided to identify very highly paid individuals in unison with a construction worker. I think those are kind of two different types of the working class, if I may call them that. But then again, because they're not capitalists, and Trump is a capitalist, I think that has a lot to do with why this was represented, is because the individuals in this picture obviously do not typically run their own companies. While, I think that it might make it more relatable to not only higher paid individuals, but also, I don't know, kind of, it makes it probably feel more inclusive. Inclusivity is all the rage these days. Here's another post from their Twitter account, it says, as we take some time to relax and reflect on this Labor Day, let's also think about how we can help build the maximum unity needed to defeat the fascist danger in November. So they've already been calling Trump a fascist. They believe he's a fascist. And it seems that they are now kind of pushing unity in voting Trump out. If voting is even on their radar, it's hard to say, considering that we've had so many protests and interesting events going on in the U.S. I think it's really worth noting that these people may not be relying on votes to win the election, or may not accept votes if they lose the election. I think that's worth noting. Anyway, the whole point of this post is, one, to start identifying and monitoring the organizations that are heavily involved in this defund, abolish the police movement, specifically the groups, obviously, that are organized by communist rhetoric. I think it's really important not to allow these communist groups and communist parties to fly under the radar without being addressed, because otherwise what happens is we have their influence floating around without people actually really understanding that these parties exist and are influential, if you know what I mean. So if you guys are interested in looking at the sources that I referenced throughout this article or this video, I recommend that you go to the blog. I will copy the link below so that you guys can click on it and go to the sources. I always post the sources at the bottom of my articles. Here we have about 11 sources referencing these organizations that I've mentioned. This article is going to be kind of unique because it's going to keep a running tally of these communist groups and parties that are continuously forming. Obviously we only have a few here listed in this article. At some point I would really like to get it to the point where we have addressed and covered every group that is now operating in the U.S. so that they are being monitored. I think this is important not just for communists, but also for very far right individuals who are, like white supremacist like real white supremacist organizations. Like for example, I'm not sure if you would classify the the Boogaloo Boys as far right. I think most people would consider them far right. However, they are kind of like trying to incite a civil war. So I'm not sure if they're actually anarchists according to their own definitions. That said, most people typically classify them as extreme right. And so I think that it is important to also do a running tally of extreme right organizations that have become influential, and at some point I will be doing that. I just feel that at this point, these organizations are very front and center. These communist organizations are very front and center. They've become very influential. And because our students today are never actually educated on what communism looks like or what its history is, people are a little bit more susceptible to falling into that trap, whereas people are typically very well educated, not very well educated. People are basically educated on what happened in Nazi Germany and the impact of racial superiority ideologies, and how those can be very detrimental to society. So I feel that people are a little bit more aware and alert of the dangers of the far right as opposed to being aware and alert of the dangers to the far left, which is why I went about going and doing this blog first. So that said, we do have what appears to be a very real communist problem here in the U.S. We have Marx, Mao, and Lenin's ideologies floating around not only college campuses like Harvard, but also just floating around the internet unchecked, as we can see here. They're all over Facebook, all over Twitter, and all over Instagram. So anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed the blog or the article. If you would like to stay up to date on the posts and articles that we publish, I recommend that you go to our site and just enter your email. You can subscribe. If you really enjoy this content, you can donate to our site. That would be very appreciated. I need a bulletproof vest, and it would be very helpful if you guys donated. But if not, no worries. Share it, like it, comment, whatever works for you. Thank you all for watching. I will see you in the next video. Bye, guys.